Welcome to On the Go with AAUW, the American Association of University Women. I'm your host, Jennifer DeSano, the Executive Director of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at George Mason University. Today on the show, we're going to be talking about the Apothecary Museum in the city of Alexandria. Joining us in the studio are Gretchen Bulova, Acting Director, Office of Historic Alexandria, and Lauren Gleason. She is the site manager of the Stabler Leadbeater Apothecary Museum. Welcome, Gretchen and Lauren. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
We usually start this show off with talking about how you arrived at your positions at the museum or within the city of Alexandria. What's your story? So we can start with you, Gretchen.
Well, I personally wanted to be in the museum field since I was a little kid. We moved to the DC area when I was 12. And we spent every weekend touring the Smithsonian, and it made just a huge impact on me. So I went to school and studied archaeology, and then I got a master's in museum studies so that I could run a museum. And my first job out of school was working at Gadsby's Tavern, which is part of the Office of Historic Alexandria today. Mm-hmm. So I've worked at Gadsby's in many capacities as a curator, as the assistant director, the director, and I've just slowly had different jobs within the Office of Historic Alexandria.
That's really wonderful. You're able to put that passion from childhood into a real career, which is fantastic, what we all strive for. And Lauren?
I grew up as an art nerd, really, and in college decided to go into the museum field, and I studied art history and went to graduate school and got a master's degree in museum education because I knew that education within museums was the fun part. And during graduate school, I got a part-time job with Historic Alexandria as one of the many front desk museum aides, and we do programs and all the great activities that the city does. And they eventually, after about a year after I finished graduate school, hired me as the site manager of the Apothecary Museum. Been there ever since, been 8 or 9 years now.
And so the Apothecary Museum is actually housed within the museum, the Office of Historic Alexandria. Can you tell us how that structure is and how it evolved?
Sure. So the Office of Historic Alexandria is actually a department of city government, of City Alexandria government. And so our office runs 7 museums, the Alexandria Archaeology Program, which is really unique that a city has an archaeology program. We have an Archives and Records Center, and we have 5 additional historic sites. So the Apothecary Museum is one of our 7 museums.
Wow, that's a lot to manage.
It is. It's exciting. It's really a nice portfolio, and again, it really is a real testament to Alexandria and its vision for having a historic community that it funds such a great program.
Yeah, I mean, and why not? It's like a treasure trove, literally.
Exactly. Yeah.
Digging in the sand on the beach, and you're going to find some archaeological
18th century ships.
Yes,
the latest find.
Yes,
lots of
absolutely. Ships. The Apothecary Museum. It started out as not a museum. It started out as a business in what, 1700s?
1792.
Okay.
Edward Stabler moves to Alexandria and opens up his little apothecary shop, and it stays in his family for 141 years, and finally in 1933 his great-grandson declares bankruptcy and closes the shop, and he dies just 3 days after he had declared bankruptcy, so no one to take over the shop, no one to save the shop, so it goes into foreclosure. The bank holds a bankruptcy auction, and a little group of locals in Alexandria, all the way back in the 1930s, they're interested in preserving the city's history. They raise money, and along with a gentleman from Baltimore who was also very interested in saving these pharmaceutical artifacts, they join forces in the middle of the auction, and they end up buying everything that had been left behind, and they just leave it on site and spend the next 6 years turning it into a museum. And so it officially opened to visitors as a museum in 1939.
So they could walk into the museum and it was like going back in time, and it was just, nothing was touched. All of the chemicals were still on the shelves, and people could just come in and kind of breathe the air and or the dust.
Or worse. Yeah.
And that's what's so interesting
Safe now.
is that the drawers, when you pull them out, the actual contents and the original packaging are still in the containers.
That's really fascinating.
Yeah, about 20% of the containers, the jars and the drawers and cans, have their original contents in them that was left behind in 1933.
And that went on from 1933 till 2006 as kind of just a backstreet mini museum that was really just a snapshot that was left alone, and not much curating was really going on necessarily in there during that period.
Well, the Landmark Society that had come together to purchase the buildings and work to save the buildings and the collections ran it as a museum up until 2006. And so as a small nonprofit, they did what they could to keep the doors open and to feature elements of the collection. So by the time 2004 hits, the building really needs a full restoration, and they go ahead and they raise quite a bit of money through a capital campaign, and they install a sprinkler system. They renovate so that you could go to the second floor. They make some hard decisions about what they're going to be able to fix and what they can't, and then they decide in the best interest of the museum, they should turn it over to the city of Alexandria so that it becomes part of the Office of Historic Alexandria portfolio.
And that's where you come on board.
That's where we step in. And I really was not part of that discussion, and it came as quite a surprise, a pleasant surprise. I was the director of Gadsby's Tavern Museum at that point. And since our museum was closest to the Apothecary, so diagonally across Market Square,
it's on your turf.
I assumed kind of ownership over the building, and we knew that this museum was coming to us, so we knew about August, and they wanted us to open it for Veterans Day in November. Wow. And so with that goal, we cleared the contents of the museum out so that we could catalog them and decide how we were going to interpret the museum.
Explain that process, because it sounds simple when you say we cleared it out, but I don't really think it was that so much. Tell me what was involved and who was involved.
It was a lot of strategy that went into that. So we actually found space within a city building that wasn't being used. So there was the old health department building, which is kind of fitting since it's related to the apothecary and health. But there was a room that was available to us, and so we set up a processing lab within that space. So we painted it, we sealed the floors, we put in an alarm system, and we created shelving and washing stations so that when we physically packed up and moved every single object in that museum, we put it into a truck and we went down the street and unloaded it into this processing lab. And with the help of interns through the George Washington University Museum Studies program, and we used contract curators, we cleaned and labeled and described, so we cataloged every single
photographed.
object.
We have photographs of everything in the collection.
And some stuff was fragile, so it went into a pile that we'd raise money to conserve piece by piece. And we determined what would go back on view in the apothecary, and then what was either in poor condition or we would never really use it as far as our interpretation. And those items are now in an off-site storage facility.
And in the end, the cataloging took 6 years.
Wow.
So it wasn't a quick procedure.
It was around the clock. And we had to learn what a lot of these objects actually were, what the contents were.
Well, some were hazardous chemicals.
Some were. Yes, we found out a lot of, looking up the ingredients, what a lot of these things did or contained. For example, we found out that Paris green, while it looks very pretty, is actually arsenic, and so it cannot be mixed with water. So it's very dangerous.
Yeah.
And so we also worked with our local code enforcement fire department to understand what these chemicals are and what we were putting back into the apothecary, because if we ever had a disaster, whether the sprinkler system erupted or whether there was a fire or an earthquake where stuff fell off the shelves, we had to know how these chemicals would interact with each other so that we could plan for the future. So this was definitely a collaborative effort.
So you did this whole process, and then you selectively brought some things back to the museum shelves and opened your doors. When did the doors open to the public again?
So we opened it for November 11th of 2006, and if you were to have walked through the doors then, it was a very different look than it is today. When we opened, especially opening day, we had a few people in character, being Edward Stabler and customers of the period. But we had just a few token bottles on the shelves to give people the idea that it was an apothecary.
Right. You had a few multicolored bottles of different things.
Right.
So those were actually original, though. So you brought those back in the original bottles with the original contents and put them back on the shelf.
Exactly.
These were the safer.
But right from the start, it was important to us that we opened the doors and started giving tours. And we had conversations like, what exactly are we going to talk about? So initially we talked about the building history, the preservation of the building, and the collection and the process we were going to go through. So now we talk about the family and them being part of the community.
Yeah, and the medicines. Yeah, that's largely what I've done over the years, is what are we going to talk about on tours when visitors come in, and it's really been decided by what the visitors are interested in. For the most part, visitors ask about what dragon's blood is, so I have found out what dragon's blood is, and I educate all of the tour guides.
What is dragon's blood?
It's resin from a tree called the dragon tree that's native to North Africa, and it was primarily used as red pigment for paint historically.
Okay.
And it makes for great Harry Potter programs.
Okay.
It's the red and violin
Yeah.
varnish. And,
So the red violin. That's right. So you're now doing some educational programming that is more contemporary. So you're talking a little bit about the Harry Potter as a tour. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So Harry Potter programming was definitely the first specialty programming that we offered at the Apothecary Museum very early on.
Well, if I can interject.
You did once before I came along.
Well, the final book was released right when we first had taken over this museum, and so we participated in a citywide initiative where
to celebrate that.
To celebrate Harry Potter,
right? So that actually was our very first public programming.
So what kind of
at the
things were
museum.
involved with that programming for the museum?
Well, and so Lauren has taken our programming to a different level, but at that point you could come in and essentially we had things listed like pumpkin seeds. What did that do? And then we'd tell you, that was how that
Medicinally would help people.
Exactly.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
and then other sites around the city. They had like dancing classes, like the
Gatsby's
ball that's in the
Tavern,
fourth Harry Potter
Yeah.
book, and things like that. But now we do a big annual event for Harry's birthday at the end of July. This year it's on July 28th and 29th, 2018. And it originally started as a guided tour where we focus on the historic Muggle medicines that inspired Harry Potter potions and herbology. So dragon's blood, of course. We also have ingredients like mandrake root and unicorn root and wolfsbane. And there are about 30 ingredients that I've been able to identify so far that are in the museum that are also mentioned in somewhere within the official Harry Potter world as a potions ingredient, whether it's from the books or the movies, et cetera. And so we focus on the potions. We try and keep it pretty potions specific since we're an apothecary shop. And it was family tours initially. We bring in Hooray for Books, the local kids bookstore. They partner with us and they run trivia and make the event more of a festival, little festival. And after a few years, we keep noticing there are a lot of grown-ups coming to this event without children.
Trying to buy tickets.
Yeah, so we said, let's try a cocktail party. So it's actually now 2 events, the family tours and then the adults-only cocktail party, where it's still a Harry Potter tour of the museum, but you get a cocktail that's potions inspired.
Butter bear? That's it?
No, we did a long bottom for 1 year. It was very strong gin and tea based drink. It was delicious.
Well, actually, thinking about medicinal, medicines that are going to help you feel better. I know that you've been archiving a lot of the original documents which were left in place after the 1933 foreclosure, and you're taking those and you're scanning them, and you maybe can do some research. Or are you planning some research around like what were the most common ailments over different periods of time, or was there a surge in certain prescriptions that were made during certain periods of historical relevance?
Yeah, we've been scanning letters, invoices, prescriptions, the ledger books from the original collection, and we're almost finished with that, 10, 12 years later. And we're starting to make some of that research available online. So if you go to our website, apothecarymuseum.org, you can see some of our initial scans, and you can look through them and you can start doing research yourself, so that you can.
That's
like,
fantastic.
Oh, well, maybe I want to see how peppermint was used, or
yes. So the
something
recipes
else.
have been scanned in,
So the recipes, actually, we have one recipe book from the collection, and we have recently reprinted that, so it is available for sale in our gift shop.
Oh, okay.
And it's nicely done with the history of the museum. As a preface, and then we've scanned the actual pages, so it looks just like you're reading through the original.
Oh, that's very cool.
Apothecary recipe book. But there's a lot of things in there that are like cough medicine.
Yeah, there's a root beer recipe in there. A lot of the recipes contain substances that are now controlled. Some of them have opium in them, which you can't really get that anymore in the United States.
But it's good. It's good, especially for research.
Yeah. And just for clarification, our archives are really the business paperwork that was left behind from this business. So that's why it has such a breadth of pieces with invoices versus ledger books and recipes and everything.
Right.
And is it Martha Washington, one of the
yes, the most famous
customers?
documents in our
Yeah,
archives.
she orders castor oil and
April 22nd, 1802.
Yep. Actually, just a little bit before she passes
Yeah,
away,
1
which
month
is kind of
before.
Wow, that's
sad,
interesting.
But that's one thing that you can come and see on display.
Yeah,
when
that
you take
will
your
always
tour.
be on display because it's so well known, and there are newspaper articles from the 1930s when the place is closing down and going up for auction, and it's even mentioned in the articles that this note from Martha Washington is going up for auction.
But that's what's so interesting about these ledgers. Is it's really a who's who of everyone in Alexandria and what they're purchasing. So it's not necessarily that you, Martha Washington, came into the apothecary, but you had directed somebody to come and place your order.
Yeah.
So you see, Dr. Crake, a lot of the prominent doctors that you know from your George Washington history, a lot of,
So they
founding
may have
names.
been filling.
Descendants of George Mason. George Mason does not overlap. The original George Mason doesn't overlap with our apothecary shop,
Right.
but some of his descendants are in our archives, which is
Wow.
Yeah. Robert E. Lee is purchasing lavender for migraines. He also
paint.
whitewash. Yeah.
Oh,
for
wow.
for mansion,
The Mount
yeah.
Vernon, one of my favorites is the Mount Vernon Ladies Association purchases paint. So presumably right after they have purchased Mount Vernon to be a museum, and they're
Yeah,
sprucing
it's
it up.
exciting.
Wow.
The apothecary is not only selling medicines, it's has a line of cosmetics, farm equipment, seeds. You could buy
It's like a
spectacles.
general store
Yeah,
in some ways.
it's your local, like today's CVS.
Yeah, I like to think of it as a chemistry shop, because today we think pharmacy really just medicine, but it's more along the lines of a drugstore where you have a real wide variety of items you can purchase. But they weren't just making medicine. The apothecary would have been making paints and dyes and perfumes and cleaning products and pesticides. Photo processing chemicals would have been purchased from an apothecary.
Right, and it's important to know that they're retailing, but they're also wholesaling to the nearby states and other apothecaries.
Yeah, they peak around 1910, and we think they owned 11 buildings by that point in Alexandria, and they were supplying about 500 wholesale customers in the Washington, D.C. region. So lots of pharmacies and doctor's offices and hospitals and other types of businesses that needed chemistry in bulk.
So walk us through the museum itself. So if we were to imagine we were going into the museum and the first thing that we see are these bottles on the wall, And then there are different levels to the museum that are.
Well, first you'd step into our fantastic gift shop.
Okay.
And once you go through our fantastic gift shop, you'd be taken on a tour of the museum, because we are guided tour only because the museum's so fragile. So on the first floor, this is a close-up behind us of the retail shop. So it's white shelves with really ornate Gothic woodwork at the top of the shelves, and these beautiful hand-blown glass bottles, mid-19th century bottles with gold leaf labels. And like we said earlier, many of them have their original contents in them still. Counters on either side, marble and wood counters. It's all original, and you can see the wear of hundreds of years of people, leaning up against the counters and shooting the breeze and ordering their medicine. And then you'd go upstairs next, and the original laboratory of the pharmacy is up on the second floor, and that's definitely the most amazing part of the museum. Visitors go up there, and frequently they are completely awestruck. We often hear wows and
yeah, it's like you're stepping back in time. I
Yes.
think that's the most common.
And so you don't. It's
reaction.
not what a laboratory looks like today by any means. And we also sometimes like to call it the manufacturing room, since it to us does not resemble a laboratory. It's darkly stained wooden drawers lining the walls and hanging from the ceiling, and shelving higgledy-piggledy all over the place. You kind of sometimes you look at it and I hope it doesn't fall down, but
It's
secure
adaptive
enough.
reuse.
Yeah. It was behind the scenes space. It wasn't an area where customers were entering historically into the pharmacy. So they weren't trying to make it look as nice and shiny as the first floor historic shop. And just like downstairs, a lot of the drawers and tin cans as well in the laboratory have their original contents in them too. And we offer a behind-the-scenes tour occasionally throughout the year, where we take visitors to the third floor and the basement as well. And so a regular tour, you're just going to see the historic retail shop and the laboratory, but behind the scenes, you visit the warehouse up on the third floor. And the reason we don't take visitors up there very regularly is because the stairs are original, and we don't have climate control, so in July it's
That's
quite
the
warm,
biggest
and in
reason.
January it's very cold. But all the original shelving lines the walls up in the warehouse space. We have some original crates and barrels. Some still have their products inside of them that have been sitting there, for almost 90 years now.
Wow.
And graffiti around the room. There's a few names that if you start to study the genealogy of the family, you start to recognize, like, oh, the founder's daughter married a Fawcett, and there's some kid wrote his name up there, whatever Fawcett, and maybe that's the founder's great-grandson. And we also will take visitors down to the basement on the behind-the-scenes specialty tours. And part of the basement we have retrofitted and sacrificed to make way for modern amenities and like fire suppression. But the other half of the basement is original. It's the brick and earth floors that are very not even.
Yes.
There's a well in the basement still that's uncapped, and so you peek at that, and a few random shelves down there. We're not entirely sure what they use the basement for other than storage, but it's really interesting, fascinating space. And one of the things I love about the basement is how you can see the original beams of the floor above you, and how they've been reinforced on either side with more recent pieces of wood. And so the architectural preservation of the building can be really fascinating
It's
as
really
well.
intact.
So you mentioned earlier that when you did the original move of everything in the museum to the space where you then did your archiving, you had George Washington University students help. Did you also have do you have other internships or programs with other universities in the area as well?
We've worked collaboratively with a lot of local universities. For example, George Mason University, they have a great special events programs, and so we've used interns to help us design and implement, and even do a little fundraising and auction item solicitation to get that experience with doing events.
And programming, and and I know you do some stuff with high school students, right?
Project Enlightenment.
At McLean High School.
Yeah, McLean High School, which fortunately doesn't exist anymore, but in years past they would come and do a program on site for us every year. They were 18th century reenactors, so students as reenactors, and some of the students would choose a scientist or an apothecary, and so they would come and do little presentations for the visitors as they went through the museum.
Well, we like our period pieces, right? So then there was an initiative with a local TV show, or a state of Virginia. What's the name of that? Mystic or
Mercy
Street.
So
yes.
PBS did a show for 2 years, Mercy Street, and it was based on the Civil War history of Alexandria, although it was filmed in Petersburg, in parts of Richmond. But it was primarily the Mansion House Hospital, which is now Carlisle House Museum. It was in the front of Carlisle House. But this story, kind of unfolded and included a lot of the historic sites in Alexandria. So,
and this show was heavily based on real history. A lot of the characters were real Alexandrians. Two of the nurses on the show, because it was a Civil War hospital drama, which overlapped really well with the Apothecary Museum. So two of the nurses had written memoirs, and so there was primary source information about what nurses were doing in Alexandria at the time. And it allowed us as a museum to focus on a bit of pop culture that also happens to be history. I love pop culture in museums. And so we did a special exhibit of archival material that was from the Civil War period. And since some of the characters on the TV show were real people, some of them were in our archives and they had purchased at the apothecary shop in the 1860s. So we had those records on display, and we incorporated those very specific aspects of Civil War history, the medicine that they're talking about on the TV show, the characters that are on the show that are existed in real life, on all of our tours. And we also created a specialty tour that was a Mercy Street themed tour. So basically, after each episode, I'm watching the episode, like, okay, taking notes, and then a week later, I'm giving a special tour talking about whatever hadn't popped up in last week's episode, and that was delightfully popular.
It sounds like you have a lot of fun in your job.
Yes, I do.
And so if you want to learn more about the Apothecary Museum, you can go online, apothecarymuseum.org.
Right.
And if you want to volunteer, you're always looking for tour guides. Yes?
Please, yes.
We give half-hour tours, and our tours we've decided to limit to 10 people to try to protect the historic space. It's a very narrow building, but we do need tours for weekday and weekend, and we do allow our volunteers to give some of these more in-depth specialty tours. So our behind-the-counter tours, one of our volunteers who's giving it actually wears a lab coat, and she has a lot of fun with it.
That sounds wonderful.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Gretchen and Lauren, for sharing this information with us today. And if anyone is interested in going online at apothecarymuseum.org to learn about how you can sign up to become a tour guide or get involved at all in the museum, but this has been really fun. Thank you so much. And thank you for watching On the Go with AAUW.